Admitting everyone in. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay, can see me and hear me well. So just a little bit of an overview for logistics. If you're comfortable, you're more than welcome to pop your camera on. However, we just advise staying muted throughout the session until there's time for questions at the end. And we'll begin in about a minute or so. So let's just take some time to get into a comfy seat. If you want to grab yourself a cup of tea or a snack, now would be a great time to do so. And we're just going to wait a few more moments to allow any other participants to trickle in. Okay, so I'm just admitting participants in as they join, so just don't mind me for a few moments while I do this. And again, just allowing yourself to find a comfortable posture. We will not be meditating in tonight's session. Just for those of you who have previously joined our format beforehand, this is primarily a conversation between Gabe and I, who I will introduce shortly. So let's just get into a comfortable seat. And if it actually feels supportive for you, you can also grab a notebook if you'd like. And if you do have any questions that you would like to ask either Gabe or I, today would be a great time to do so. And I would just recommend saving those questions until the end of the session, about 45 minutes in or so, and then I'll allow you to ask the questions and we can hear the answers from Gabe as well. So as I continue to admit people in, I'll just give a little bit of an overview for those of you who have not joined us before. Welcome. My name is Kirat and I am a contemplative mentor and the head meditation instructor at Standard Dose. So the new format of this series, as you probably noticed from the website, and if you joined us on Monday, is that instead of sticking to each evening have a specific theme, we're now having a weekly theme where Monday we'll explore that topic in meditation. Wednesday, we'll explore that topic with a guest speaker and learn about their perspective. And within that session, which is today's session, receive some helpful tips and tricks on how to now work with this topic ourselves in our own homes. And then Friday, it'll simply be a conversational session where those of you who do want to share experiences, who want to connect with like-minded individuals and really receive support on further digestion of that topic, Friday is definitely the topic and the session for you. So those of you who are joining, and if you've joined us beforehand, I'm sure you know me already. I'll just skip the heavy introduction. But for those of you who don't, my name is Kirat. And now I'll introduce our guest speaker, Gabe Kennedy, who is the co-founder of Plant People. And he'll also give you a brief overview of Plant People and just a bit of background on his role there. So I'll hand it over to Gabe.
Thanks so much. So great. And I'm so delighted to see that people are joining. So thanks for sharing some time, some space, and thank you for so thoughtfully kind of creating this. As Kirat had mentioned, my name is Gabe. I am the co-founder of Plant People. Our mission is to heal and connect people on the planet through the power of plants. We do that by focusing on efficacious product, really putting customer outcome first and foremost, and figuring out how we can be creative to do that, and rooted in the research that we now have the privilege to look back upon. But also focusing on education resources, knowledge sharing, building an industry that is equitable and accessible, that stands for social justice and climate justice, that works for everyone, and that is building a better future for both people and planet. And then also stepping into sort of regenerative activities, right? And acknowledging that we're in a moment in time where simply sustaining the status quo is not enough. We really have to be active participants in the health of our communities, in the health of our world, in our own health, and work to rebuild that. And so that is really rooted in regenerative agriculture. It's rooted in the ways in which we do business and how we package. It's also the ways in which we give back, planting trees and working on a variety of equity programs. And so that's kind of what we do at Plant People. We're not simply a CBD company. We're a company that is really celebrating the power of all plants. My personal background is as a chef and sort of participant in the plant-based packaged good industry. And so I've had a fair amount of experience, with the idea of food and mood, with the idea of being able to integrate healthful products into our lives. And on a more personal note, I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. Both of my parents are in alternative medicine. My mom is an acupuncturist and herbalist. My father is a chiropractor and acupuncturist. And so many of the conversations that I often have today are things that I have been hearing for a very long time. So it's really nice and empowering to kind of feel as though I'm following in their footsteps to some extent. But I'm really happy to be here. And I think that of course, you'll probably will jump into like the topic, but I did really find what is going on right now to be quite interesting, because there's all these feelings that bubble up, and perhaps an umbrella that many of us are feeling and will often feel, and is a sort of human connector, is that of grief. And so I thought, what seems like an interesting thing to explore, and a great thing to explore. So thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here and for that eloquent introduction. So, for those of you who joined us on Monday, and even if you didn't join us on Monday, we recognize that grief is somewhat of a complex emotion, as it can really be associated with different kinds of feelings and it can manifest differently for different people, especially within the container of the quarantine, of social distancing and being contained in our own homes. And especially for those of us who are in solitude, the container of space and silence can really bring up a lot of unresolved emotions, and especially grief, and recognizing all of the ways that we haven't allowed ourselves to actually grieve. So, with that in mind, it's a word that's typically thrown around, but Gabe, I'm interested in knowing, how would you define grief?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's a very complex emotion. But I think that for me, it is around the feeling of course, loss, but underneath that is the destabilization of what one had known to be true and what one had known to be constant. And it is now missing. And I think that in that absence, it bubbles up a lot of emotion. And the way that it manifests, is sort of endless. But when I reflect on when I've felt the feelings of grief, it really has been in those moments of a departure from something that has been such a truth, such a constant, or something that had felt very connected to, whether it was conscious or subconscious. It becomes more apparent when there's a departure.
Definitely. There's something true about absence making the heart grow fonder. And also recognizing as well that the presence of grief can really change, especially depending on the intensity of the bond or the attachment, which was primarily disrupted. So, like I mentioned beforehand, grief can really manifest differently for different people. And I know in my personal experience, I first can notice grief when its primary manifestation inhibits my daily functioning, when other things sort of become an extra hassle, even day-to-day things in making myself breakfast or answering an email. I'm noticing this heavy kind of obstacle that's preventing me from just functioning in a smooth way like I usually do. So, how does grief manifest for you personally, and what other emotions are associated with it? Like we mentioned, it's rarely an isolated incident. So, how else does it show up for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it has shown up in very unexpected ways. And it's, of course, the feelings of loss. I think that there are feelings of, confusion. There can be more reactive behavior more anger. I could be more critical. I know that, there's those classic, right? It's like the AP Psych class that maybe many of us have taken, but it's those classic stages of grief, right? Of going through denial, going through anger, feeling depressed in what it is that we're experiencing. Then there becomes a reckoning where we're bargaining with like the truth that is now real. And then finally, and ultimately, the acceptance. And so I think that when I reflect on, okay, when I feel a loss, when I feel, and mind you, it could be, and I guess I'll just be really honest. For me, the transition of a relationship, or even the grief of my own health. I mean, I've had a pretty severe back injury that I've dealt with for years and years and years now, and it recently kind of kicked back up, and it was like this grief of my own stability and my own health, and like in that, I've felt I felt myself at times not resorting to, but defaulting to those moments of hypercriticism or reactivity. And I think that when I can take a step back from it, I can realize that it is an opportunity to build empathy, and that it is an opportunity to connect with the human experience and what makes us human, and to meet other people with empathy. Because most of the time, when I'm met with criticism or anger or annoyance or whatever it may be, it actually has nothing to do with me. And so to some extent, it's a friendly reminder, right? That there's so many things going on in people's lives, and so many of the times it doesn't have to do with our own actions. We can only claim responsibility for our actions, and pointing the finger certainly doesn't help, right? And I like to think of it like we're on a hike, and I have a 300-pound bag, and someone's like, I want to carry that one. It's like, sure, go ahead, carry it. Like I don't want to carry the bag of that I don't want to carry that baggage. But it certainly has taken, takes patience and kindness to oneself to be able to move through those things.
Definitely. It reminds me of the definition of compassion, which translates into to suffer with, and recognize that that's exactly how we have an opportunity to meet grief, is to suffer with the parts of ourselves, especially the parts of ourselves that have been fragmented, with a sense of affection and care, and recognizing that it's the presence that it's really in need of. And also going to your point in terms of the relationship that it invites you, in terms of how you show up for other people, it's true that we can only really meet people as deep as we've met ourselves, and vice versa. People can only really meet us as deep as they've met themselves. So recognizing that when we are able to sit with those difficult emotions with presence, with patience, with even forgiveness, depending on the causes of this grief, it can really allow us to show up for others in that way, and extend that same kind of friendly awareness and that same kind of understanding, which really love, it's a synonym for love, understanding, the ability to just simply recognize the perspective, the situation of someone else.
Mm.
So with that in mind, I know that you mentioned sometimes defaulting to self-criticism and other ways of being. How do you typically meet grief, and what coping practices do you have in place that you usually implement, or you strengthen when navigating it?
Yeah. So I have found the most important aspect of being able to move forward is, as I believe you said, sitting with it. And I think that what all of these emotions call for is acknowledgement. And as soon as we can sit with it, as soon as we can embrace it, in fact, and welcome it in, there is a wave that happens with all emotions. And so it's like, this wave is here. I'm going to be with it. It may only last 15 seconds, but the simple acknowledgement allows it to last 15 seconds. If we push it away, you're never gonna win. And so I think that for me, it's about acknowledging. It's about setting time up to give it voice, to give the feelings, to give the emotions voice, let them air. And then it's not about fixing it. And I think that is been really important for me. I'm a fixer. I like to, I'm going to fix this problem. It's allowing it to coexist. it's allowing the yin and the yang. It's allowing the light within the dark and the dark within light to exist within harmony. And so that has been very powerful, right? Accepting what is, sitting with it, giving it voice when it comes up. And if it is, it's sometimes getting ahead of it by trying to, break out a little time in the morning to maybe just like sit with or bring awareness to what's going on and say, okay, I'm going to feel this now. Now I can move forward and I'll acknowledge it if it comes up again. But if I continue to push it off to the side, it's highly toxic. So the coping practices have been, for me, really allowing sharing and allowing support, the importance of asking for help and knowing that asking for help is okay. Right. And that it really is critical, I think, to have someone to emote to, right? To not be alone in any of the things that we're dealing with as people, but rather emoting and identifying that this is a part of the human experience, that we deserve to be nourished and that we can nourish ourselves in a variety of ways. So the ways that I've done that is really bringing my mind to both micro and macro, and realizing kind of the microcosms that exist, right? Even in gardening, you see the energy and the effort that it takes for a seed to break the soil and to grow. And then it goes through this beautiful life cycle and then it dies, but it does begin again. And so on a micro level, there's all of these, these realizations. And on a macro level, there's these realizations. We're seeing it every day. But I think that the real question that I ask myself is, how is it that we incorporate these emotions moving forward? And the incorporation, the integration of grief and the realizing that it's just simply a part of life is really critical. And so I think that to some extent, if I'm feeling sad, I can remind myself that we grieve so much, or I grieve so much because I also know love so much. And knowing that love also comes along with knowing the pain. They can't exist independently.
Oh my God, so much magic in that response. I don't even know where to begin. Something that you said originally at the very beginning really stuck out to me in terms of recognizing that it's the coexistence of the yin and the yang, and the light and the dark. And a quote that came to mind that Carl Jung referenced in one of his books, he didn't say this, he was quoting somebody else. I don't know the original person who said this, but he said that the darkness itself calls forth the helpful light. So it's within the darkness itself that the actual light, the wisdom, the magic of healing really occurs. It's in sitting in the depths of that pain, in that discomfort, in the grief, and recognizing that there is wisdom there. And it essentially allows us to invite the question, instead of even coping with grief or releasing grief, it's how do we live with it? How do we actually integrate it in a way where it becomes part of who we are? It's the wisdom that we've carried from our past wounds of loving, of letting ourselves fall and be attached and create bonds, recognizing that even in the pursuit of those bonds, there is an impermanence to it all. And that's why it's so precious. It's because it won't be here forever. This person won't be here forever. This relationship, this opportunity, this part of ourselves, it's not always going to be here. So with that in mind, I think the spaciousness is really important. It's really allowing it to be seen and just noticing the presence of the attention of our own hearts, just how medicinal that can be when we just acknowledge it. And it's in the witnessing itself, in the acknowledging itself, that dismantles the additional pain that we put on ourselves when we resist grief or when we try to change our experience in any way. So for those who are more interested in a pragmatic, less emotional response to grief, how do you think nutrition can support this? And what role do you think nutrition plays in particular when working with grief, but also emotions like hopelessness and sadness?
Yeah. So I think that food and the integration of what tools we have tangibly at our disposal is so fascinating. And as I'd mentioned, I have a deep relationship with food, having been a predominantly plant-based chef and sort of creator of product and whatnot throughout my life. And so I think that there's so much power and therapy that lies in this. And so I think that, when we're dealing with grief, when we're dealing with loss, when we're dealing with challenging times, it's more important than ever to eat with life force, right? If we're grieving, we're experiencing death, we're experiencing loss, we're experiencing hurt. Food is life. Food is rebirth. Food is vitality and force. And so I like to be able to connect with sort of the personification of food. And I think that, the grounding nature of roots and tubers, right, is important, right? If I'm feeling too lofty, I can eat some root vegetables and root down. If I'm, needing to connect with like life force, it's like seeds and nuts and right, like seeds of everything that are necessary for plant life within them, and we get to eat them. It's very cool. And really nurturing ourselves with nutrients, because as sort of as ethereal as that may seem, the reality is that 50% of our dopamine is in our gut. 90% of our serotonin is in our gut. You are what you eat. And so if we can bring awareness to the balance that our body systems require, and oftentimes that lies within, a well-balanced plant-based diet, then we're unlocking the potential for all of these sort of emotive chemicals or hormones that we have within us. But if our gut is unhealthy, it's going to be very challenging to unlock the 90% of the serotonin that exists and half of the dopamine that exists. So I think that, as it relates to kind of the pragmatic parts of nutrition, right? Obviously the prebiotics, the probiotics, the plant-based, eating ferments, eating something sour, eating healthy fats, eating lean proteins, cutting down on refined carbohydrates. But I think that whatever it is that we choose to consume, because I will never tell someone what they should or should not eat. That's completely not my role. To simply pique curiosity. I think that the process of food is important, because there is an immediate gratification that we get. Now we can think about the life cycle. Where did this food come from, and connect to, the greater kind of experience that food may offer. But if we just look at the preparation of a meal, we're creating something out of nothing. We're creating, with our own hand. It's empowering, and it's powerful. So I think that the idea of making food, of being able to share food, of being able to eat with one another, of being able to lean on food as a pillar of community and creation is important. I think there can be ritual that I've added in, of simply lighting a candle, creating some space and energy around a feeling or emotion or a person or an idea, and like lighting it and letting it sit, letting it exist. And so I get super pumped on it. And I think like I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to really rediscover my love of cooking over the last few months, and maybe last few years. But when you do it every day, day in, day out professionally, it's like, okay, I'm ready for some takeout. But that is not necessarily the best option for me now. And it's been really nurturing. So I think it's just finding the ritual in it, and then being able to connect with the things that we know we should be eating. Like like maybe you don't want to only eat plants. Fine, eat your meat. All good. I don't care. But we know that we should be eating more plants. We know that we should be eating more vegetables. We know we should stay away from refined carbohydrates and processed foods. And when we do that, the reality is that we feel better. And the reality is that we can actually boost our immunity quite quickly, and really get ourselves to a pretty great space, faster than we thought we could. So it was a little bit of a tangent, but I care about it. So
It's really beautiful to see. And I think that there's something really special about the way you spoke about the attributes of food, in terms of when you're in need of more groundedness, more stability, and eating root vegetables and seeking out those heavier grounding foods. And perhaps when seeking out feelings of vitality and potential and growth, going towards seeds and nuts. And
yeah, leafy greens, the
that's something that's so it feels very intuitive. Like it's not something that's drastically surprising, but it's not something I've considered before. So can you speak a little bit more about the energetic attributes of food? And for someone who isn't used to this, like how does one become familiar with that? And what's a good source? How does one start in working with the energy of food?
That's a great question. I'm still trying to figure it out. I mean, I think like some of the super simple things like plant a seed, plant a seed and see what it takes. And I think that, that process is therapeutic, right? To watch something grow in time. And right now we also move in hyperspeed. If the web page doesn't load, if my phone is spazzing out, I mean, it's like, what's wrong? But we forget it takes 110 days for a watermelon to grow. It's 70 days for a tomato, and we eat these things within a matter of seconds or minutes. And so I do think that, the idea of planting something, of connecting to the source of the food is the most kind of pure way of being able to understand perhaps what those energetic attributes are. But when we think about a plant, we think about the roots, right? The roots ground the plant in stability. It is the sort of traction point for nutrients. When we are talking about stalks and stems, it's giving us, the opportunity to stand tall and to face the sun. When we're talking about the leaves and the flowers, we're talking about expanse, and we're talking about, momentary kind of flowers don't last forever, right? They kind of like bloom and they're gorgeous. And they connect us to like perhaps the potential and the beauty that exists within this plant. And it pollinates, right? Pollination happens, and then it dies, but it happens again. And so I think that intuitively, and just sort of sitting with it is a really powerful tool. There is a very simple book by Thich Nhat Hanh, which is How to Eat, and it talks about, he does a how to sit, how to love, how to eat, and it's about, the entire world being in, I think it's maybe a soybean or something, I don't know, in a grain. And when you think about that grain, at the end of the day, right, it comes out of soil. When we die, we go back into the soil. So our ancestors are in this grain, the sun, the wind, animals, pollinating, insects pollinating, people. I mean, every single like life force has sort of like touched the agricultural system. Maybe not now in the monocropped society we live in, but in true agriculture, it is. And so that would be my recommendation. I would say like plant a seed, see what happens. Think about it, see what happens. Read the Thich Nhat Hanh book, see what happens.
Yeah.
Or hit me up while we can talk about it.
That's lovely. And Thich Nhat Hanh is someone that I've really been inspired by in many ways. And for those of you who don't know, he's a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher and speaks wonderfully just about pain and grief, especially from what his family, his culture, and his society at large went through during the Vietnam War, and really how he met the horrors of that and the aftermath of that with Buddhist principles of recognizing, like you mentioned, Gabe, the interconnectedness of life, all of the causes and conditions that have essentially come together to collaborate to support the manifestation of what we're seeing now. So really that's essentially how he speaks about grief too, is recognizing everything that had to have happened in order for us to experience this emotion, which essentially means celebrating that moment of connection, that moment of attachment that had to have primarily happened and occurred before we're now experiencing the loss of it. So going off that notion of interconnectedness, for those of us who, and I'm sure there are many of us now, who are really grieving the loss of social connection, especially of family and close loved ones, how can working with food, with these attributes, and even the process of just cooking, how can these mediums be used as supports for social connection?
How can the mediums of food and I mean,
food, cooking, nutrition,
yeah,
this engaging in these things.
Get in there, get your hands dirty. I mean, I think it's sort of what we've been talking about, right? The opportunity to take the time and space to dedicate for nourishment, to dedicate for giving to yourself, to others. the process that involves, the patience that it involves, the attention and staying present, right? I mean, cooking is not just following a recipe. Cooking is listening, it's smelling, it's seeing, it's tasting, it's putting the thing in the pan and knowing and being mindful to, it's starting to feel, it smells like it's cooked, right? And you look and, oh, it's kind of golden brown, and okay, that looks nice. I'm going to turn it over. Right? Oh, it's burnt, right? We can be informed by our senses so much. But I think that, you know, it's challenging to find connection in this time. And I've, you know, fortunately I'm with my family, but I'm going to head back to New York and I'm going to be in an apartment, and I was thinking about it and I was like, you know what, maybe it's time for me to, you know, like reach out, you make a few conscious relationship or build a few conscious connections where there's like innate trust to be able to see one another. And then being able to really like honor that space and make a meal together. And if that's not possible, or there's not a comfort level there, because I totally acknowledge that, then, you know, doing something like this. I mean, I feel like I feel very connected to you, and we just have been like chatting digitally. So I think that those would be my recommendations. But at the end of the day, it can't come from the outside to some extent, right? Like it's just got to come from in here. And so if we trace back to the idea of sitting with these emotions, or sitting and giving voice to the loss of connection, or the fear of loneliness, or the experience of isolation, then we can be able to take that forward. And it will, I'm sure, be very different for everyone. You know, so that was a challenging question for me to answer, but maybe I did a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that was really helpful. And what's coming up for me as you're saying that is also recognizing how so many of these different tools, these habits that we ought to implement before the feeling of grief arises, it's oftentimes many of us wait until the grief is here, until we're overcome and we're overwhelmed by this heaviness, by this hopelessness or sadness, or even anger and frustration at its presence, before we recognize there's something that we have to do about it. And it quite literally feels impossible when overcome by that emotion to implement change in that time frame. And that's likely, that's understandable, and I don't think that actually is a fruitful period to begin to implement new habits straight away. I feel as though that's the perfect opportunity for actually taking a moment and looking inward and holding the emotion and self-soothing in any way that we feel like is available to us, even if it is connecting via Zoom like this. But for those of us who are willing and are ready to create the proper conditions before we're overwhelmed with that feeling, say if we are experiencing a loss of some sort and before we're recognizing its emotion is here in the face, how can we, what are 3 things, for example, that we can do to implement a healthier foundation so that when grief is here, when it does feel incredibly overwhelming, we sort of have that framework in place to rely on?
Yeah, very well said. Totally agree with you. I think for me, it's establishing a source of connection and making sure that I have like the line of connection. It's establishing routine and ritual around my own kind of meditation or prayer, or whatever you want to refer to it as. So I'm going to say more than 3. I'm going to say like 4. I would certainly say that nutrition is a fundamental, like, cornerstone for how I operate. And that is not just like what foods do I eat, but the processes we discussed of cooking, perhaps the opportunity to understand like the supplements or the herbs or the plant medicines that exist to help us. I think albizia bark and flower is a phenomenal example of an herb that is known in TCM as the tree of happiness, and prescribed in TCM when someone is grieving. And then the last kind of
TCM is traditional Chinese medicine.
yeah, yeah. And we use it in the Be Calm product, and it's like something I take regularly, very uplifting. And then kind of this idea of, I don't know if you can bucket them in the same, but movement. I think that movement allows us to be empowered and to move through, and to kind of step into our own power, right? We all want to get to the top of the mountain and look over the ledge, right? We all want to stand at the edge of the bow of the boat and, feel the wind and do like the Titanic thing. Like that's, that's like so human. And so the idea of movement to create that is very powerful. And then I think the connection to nature, and perhaps nature and food is the one that I should have bundled together. But the process of connecting to the pace, connecting to the resiliency, to looking at the attributes of plants and how perhaps we should like be more plant, right? We should stand tall. We should face the sun. We should be resilient. We should be adaptive. We should root down. We should branch out. We should, show up and push through. And so those would be my things: source of connection, like meditation or prayer, whatever you would want to refer to it as, eating well and the connection that that has to nature, and then movement and being able to be empowered, like self-empowering through our own physical form.
I love those. And I really resonate with the movement. I think as someone who I practice a lot of Buddhist meditation. That's my daily practice, the shamatha breath practice. It's very still, it's very masculine in its essence. It's very focused and directed. When I'm feeling the presence of grief, it can be incredibly difficult and sometimes unsupportive to just sit there and focus on the breath, because there's so much happening at one time, especially if I'm feeling like I need to cry and to really release. So incorporating movement, even basic yogic practices or kundalini practices, have been so invaluably supportive in just moving energy, releasing the body, even bringing back my connection with the breath in a more excited way, so I don't feel as though I'm just sitting here and the grief is overwhelming me. So you've mentioned quite a bit about the attributes of plants and nutrition. Do you have specific plants in mind, a few in mind, that you would recommend implementing daily or even weekly to our grocery shop, for example, that you think can support that adaptive process, adapting to what's showing up?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to my mind are adaptogens. And I know that that's certainly a topic of the moment, right? We've all heard of them. I think it's important to recognize that not all things that are being communicated as adaptogens are adaptogens. There's a pretty specific set of criteria. But the idea is that certain compounds or plants can be supportive to our own response to stress. So I would say that adaptogens are certainly a sure way to kind of narrow or sort of whatever this movement is, like shrink kind of the variability of our own stress response and the experience that we feel when a stressful thing, or thing, situation, person, whatever is happening. And instead of really being irked by it, I've noticed it allows me to simply observe the situation and then choose my response. Another set of kind of herbs that can be supportive are nervine herbs. Nervine herbs just simply kind of soothe the nervous system. And so I think that nervines can be quite powerful during these times. And then specifically for grief, there are some classically beneficial ones, right? Albizia bark and flower, the mimosa tree. We see them, in fact, sometimes blooming in New York. It's a gorgeous tree, but is really beneficial for helping sort of uplift the spirit and cope and move through grief. Avena sativa is also helpful. Wild oat straw. It's a traditional Western herb that was kind of had a hot moment in the 80s, but we kind of see it coming back now. So I think adaptogens, nervines, and then, specifically for grief, my experience would be more with albizia bark and flower, and the wild oat straw, Avena sativa. Yeah. And then of course, as the owner of a hemp and plant company, we use, by the way, all of those in the Be Calm product. I think that, for some people, nourishing the endocannabinoid system and sort of finding ways to support balance and homeostasis through, hemp can also be really powerful as well.
Thank you for that. That was really informative. And we'll definitely be able to send out this information to our community for those of you who weren't able to grasp those names. So don't worry about that. But one thing that I noticed was in your articulation of these herbs, recognizing the ability that you had to simply observe something, observe an emotion, observe something
Mm.
difficult, and then choose your response to it. I think that there's something so profoundly freeing about that reality, and recognizing that we always have the choice in how we perceive and respond to a situation, particularly a difficult one. And with that in mind, what's coming up for me is, so in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha often spoke about the suffering of suffering, which he essentially referred to when human beings resist difficult emotions or respond to difficult emotions in an unskillful way, thereby increasing their suffering because of how they've chosen to be in relationship to the emotion. So with that in mind, what other options do you think that people have for working with difficult emotions if they feel as though resistance isn't working, or they've run out of energy to resist the emotion? Perhaps they've explored plants or meditation, but do you think there are any other modalities or any other basic activities that one can do that can bring that same sense of freedom in taking a step back, observing the emotion, and choosing how to respond with more clarity and ease? That was a long question, so take your time. I don't
Um,
think we can. Oh yeah, now we can hear you.
Ironically enough, I got a text message that came through I only saw the top and it said, "I have something sad to tell you." Ooh.
Oh no.
Ay, the heart. So I think, put that aside for a moment. I think that the question is, like, if you're bumping up against kind of or you continually are resisting the emotion, what other practices or modalities can be supportive?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes, in bringing that freedom again and choosing how we choose to respond.
Hmm.
If it's not meditation, perhaps what else can we do
Yeah.
to recognize that we have a choice in how we respond to the emotion?
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, for me, it's visualizing a river, right? It's like thinking about, or hiking, like it's thinking about, do I want to go up the stream, or perhaps can I just enjoy the ride if I let go? What happens if I let go? What am I holding on to? Why am I holding on to it? How is it serving me? Is it important for me to carry this bag up to the top of the mountain? Can I ask for help?
Mm.
Do I really need it? And I think that sometimes the analogies like that are really helpful for me, because it's hard. It's very, very hard to, like, when you're in the depths of emotion, to be able to see those things and to be able to have the will
Mhm.
to perhaps do what you know you should, but the anger is there, or the resentment is there, or the sadness is there. And so I think that the only way of being able to move through is by simply staring it in the face and saying, "Hey, I know that you're here. I'm here too. Let's figure something out." But I've always found a lot of nurturing in music. I found a lot of expression and trying to write a song. So many songs that are 3/4 of the way there, of singing, of uh, moving my body in a goofy way, of I think for many people it's painting. I think it's like connecting to those things and those moments that were so deeply, or are so deeply nourishing to you, when the world just sort of falls away. And that's going to be different for everyone. For me it's music,
Mhm.
for me it's nature, or cooking. And so that's what I often do. But it doesn't have to be meditation. It doesn't have to be, sitting down and journaling. I mean, of course those things help, and we talk about them because they do help.
Mhm.
But I think everyone is unique, so everyone's going to have their own path to it.
Mm. Definitely. And I see a pattern essentially through all of the different things that you mentioned, which resembled getting out of the mind and into the body, and really leaving the emotion just alone for a moment, letting it be there instead of constantly trying to manipulate it, release it, or fix it.
Mm.
And I think that there's something so profoundly simple about that act of just taking a breath and choosing to do something else, anything else in that moment. And oftentimes people can look at that as, oh, I don't want to distract myself, I don't want to avoid myself, or, I don't want to forget about it. And I think that there's an art to grieving. I think there's an art to relating to difficult emotions. And part of that art is learning when it's okay to just give it a break. When it's okay
Mhm.
to just say, I'm just going to go for a walk or FaceTime a friend or
Mhm.
take a bath or watch something really stupid on Netflix or whatever it is. Just take a break. That's
Such
okay.
a great point. It's such a great point.
Yeah. I
I,
think so. I mean, I'm definitely guilty of that from times. And when I was feeling something like that yesterday, I just went for a long walk and watched 4 episodes on Netflix. And then I came back to meditate, and it was so much more fruitful
Mhm.
because I felt like I could really then look at the emotion instead of it overwhelming me.
Well, I think what that brings up in me is the idea, and I struggle with this all the time. It's like I want it wrapped up in a bow. I have a conflict with someone. I'm feeling something. I'm going through something. I want to wrap it up. I want to tie it with a pretty bow and give it away. And I think that it's really important for me. And I just remember, you know what? Life isn't so clean all the time. It's actually okay to leave something feeling a little bit unresolved. It's okay to leave something um, not completely finished with your partner or your family or yourself. There's time to revisit it, and kind of knowing that that's just the way it is. I think is sometimes is actually really empowering for me. So thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah. There was something I read from the Gottman Institute recently, especially about grief that we feel in relationship to somebody else. Especially if we're in a relationship, for example, I'm grieving something or someone else outside of the relationship, and just how that impacts how we show up with our intimate relationships. And in the Gottman Institute, they said that one of the keys in working with difficult emotion when being intimate with someone else is just settling for 85%. Like
Yeah.
100% is just so unattainable, and it's not healthy. And we have this idea, I think part of the pendulum swinging back and forth is, now that we've decided to become more, we're learning to become more mindful as a society, more contemplative and more inward looking. There is such a thing as unskillful contemplation, where it just leads to rumination. There is such a thing as too much reflection, where it's no longer supportive. And it's sort of like learning. It's like, okay, I've had enough of sitting with this emotion. I need to do something, anything else, and I can come back to it. It's going to be there. I can trust that.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere.
It's
It's
not going anywhere.
yeah, I was in a conversation, um, and okay, I'll just be the obvious. So it was, how long ago was this? I was at my therapist, and he was like, "Listen, man, if you're gonna get this, reimbursed by insurance, I got to like give you a diagnosis. He was, do you want depression? Do you want anxiety?" And I was like, "Well, I don't really necessarily feel either." And I was like, "But which one would you recommend?" And he was like, "Well, I like historically, depressive characteristics are people," and this is a sweeping generalization. So I know that I'm not diagnosing anything or anyone, but depressive is sort of, yes, it's poetic, but it's like living in the past. It's like reliving these things, and like too much rumination in the mind in the past. And then anxiety is too forward looking. Like you never are present because you're so concerned with what will happen. And what that brought up in me was like, what about the present? That is the only kind of like non-diagnosed moment in time, according to him. And I was like, yeah, okay. Feels really good to just simply be in the present and show up as best as we can and give ourselves credit for showing up as best as we can in that moment.
Mm,
Right. And maybe that is just 85%,
mm.
but that 85% may be what you can give. Maybe it's your 100% at the moment.
Right. It'll be different day to day. And sometimes it'll be 50%, 40%, 5%, given the capacity that we have in that moment. And
Yeah.
that's why I think that it's a process in recognizing that it really isn't about the grief. The grief isn't the problem. The grief is a symbol that you're alive. You've been touched by
Mm.
life. It's the way that you are in relationship to it. So just allowing it to be there, letting it take a back seat and saying, okay, I know that you're there. I have other things to do. I'm going to come back. And
Right.
sometimes you might just be able to sit with it all day, holding hands, doing whatever. And that's okay. And it looks different for different people. So Gabe, thank you so much for just your insight and for sharing your experience. It really means a lot, and I'm sure that the community benefited from it.
My pleasure. Thanks for allowing me to share.
Yeah,
First time sharing many of these things in a public forum. So great conversation. Was happy to do it. Thank you for asking such thoughtful questions
of course.
and
So we
providing
have
so much
some,
wisdom. I learned a lot.
thank you. So we have some time now. If anybody has any questions or perhaps anything that they would like more clarity on, either from a nutritional perspective or just on how to handle and work with grief day to day, Gabe is our expert speaker today, but of course, if there's anything that I can provide insight on, I'm also happy to do so. So you can either unmute yourself and start speaking if you have a question, or you can just pop it in the chat function if that feels more supportive for you.
I'm responding to a, what was the name of the flower? I'm just saying albizia is the tree.
Lovely.
And then Gigi posted a beautiful quote.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Viktor Frankl quote, and that book, A Man's Search for Meaning, is a phenomenal book. For those of you actually who are interested in reading, it's a phenomenal book on loss and grief. A Man's Search for Meaning. He speaks a lot about finding meaning in his previous partnership, in his loved one, in his wife, and in his career. And that essentially was the only thing that got him through very, very difficult times. So another great resource for anyone who is looking to dive deep into literature. So do we have any questions? And if not, Gabe, there's actually one last thing I wanted to ask you, which might be a good time to ask you. How can this entire container of social containment, of being isolated, being in solitude, especially with the crazy amounts of anxiety, emotion, uncertainty that are just arising, how can this period in time be viewed as a vehicle for greater self-awareness and growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a caterpillar, right? I think that like we're going kind of into our moment of cocooning, and then hopefully we can come out on the other side as butterflies. The question is how and what happens during that transformation. And I think that we have to be patient with ourselves, because even though we may have more time on our hands, perhaps that's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do all the work that we know we should do. But I look at it as an opportunity. Like, what better time to like do the class that I wanted to do the stretching when I know that I should, to, you know, move my body, to connect with my family, to connect with friends. And sometimes I don't want to, and that's okay too. I think that we're also probably like on this like deep recovery from all of the inundation that we've had. So I personally think that, you know, bringing mindfulness and awareness to what we do on a daily basis, and just making sure that if we feel the capacity to engage in something that we know is going to be like for self-growth, then do it. But it's probably going to like be beneficial, because what other time are you going to have to do it? And if you don't, that's okay too. You know, like I saw the meme where it's like everyone wants to get on Zoom and like I don't, or something. I didn't do a great job of explaining it. I think that, yeah, for me, it's like, I'm taking up Qigong. I've wanted to learn Qigong, so I'm going to try doing more Qigong. I've been cooking more, but I do think it's just kind of meeting yourself at where you are, acknowledging perhaps what you want to create, and figuring out how do we come out of this time to rebuild in a way that is more mutually beneficial. Because there's a lot that was not necessarily right with the way things were. And perhaps it'll just go back to that way. But perhaps this is a moment that we can really look at it and figure out what we want to do to change it.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And we have a question from Lauren. Gabe, what has been your go-to comfort food during this time? Great.
I'm like, there's two things that I've done. One is I've made myself sushi.
Ooh.
My first I mean, super simple, just vegetables and stuff. Just, it's all about the rice. So I've done that quite a few times, and I make tamago, which is like tamago yaki, which is kind of the sweet Japanese omelet.
Mm.
And I put that in a little wrap. And the other is like a spiced cauliflower wrap. It just has a ton of spices in it. And then I make like a little yogurt sauce and I wrap it up in some arugula and I eat that. So those have been my two like go-tos, the sushi and the cauliflower wrap. The cauliflower wrap has a little tutorial on my Instagram if anyone wants to make it themselves. I think that maybe I did a sushi one too. But those have been my go-tos. And then like always, soup. I mean, soup, I have a spoon. I love soup so much. Never a bad time for soup.
Lovely. That sounds so funny compared to what I go to for comfort food. I'm not a big fan of cooking. I'm not good at it. I don't enjoy it too much either. So my go-to comfort food has just been almond butter and cacao nibs from this point. Still delicious. So another quick comment is if you could just speak a little bit more about ashwagandha, so that adaptogen in particular. And then we have another question about.
So I'll answer the food one first because it's on the same topic.
Perfect.
So the best lettuce for wraps, in my opinion, is like a bib lettuce, like a Boston bib, or the ones that come oftentimes, unfortunately, in a clamshell. But if you can find a non-clamshelled plastic variety, that's preferred. So yeah, the bib lettuce, but you just want broad, flat leaves. Or you can make little boats of romaine if that tickles your fancy. Ashwagandha is an Ayurvedic herb that is an adaptogen. It definitely gets a lot of press, a lot of airtime. There is some interesting pieces of ashwagandha. So it would fall into the adaptogenic category. The sort of powerful compounds within ashwagandha that you're looking for are called withanolides. And the way that you can kind of navigate the space is that herbal extracts usually come in two different forms. Or three. So you have like the raw plant itself, which is, a gram is a gram, if you will. You have standardized extracts, which are oftentimes they're standardized to the percentage of the active constituent. So in this case, it would be withanolides. Or there's ratio extracts, which would be 1-to-1, 10-to-1, 20-to-1, 50-to-1, etc. And that's not a direct correlation to weight, but it is sort of what goes into the brew, if you will. So ashwagandha is very heavily researched. In fact, KSM 66 is the world's most heavily researched ashwagandha. It is, it has a trademark next to it. The interesting thing about KSM 66, I'm just talking about ashwagandha, by the way. Like, I don't know if there's more specifics, but the interesting thing about KSM 66 is that it's actually milk extracted. So if you are like vegan or you do have a dairy allergy, just be careful. I had received KSM 66 because I wanted to buy it for one of our products, and I saw on it that there was a dairy warning, and I was like, huh. So that's how I learned it. I learned it the hard way, and sent it back for a non-dairy-fied version. But yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful adaptogen. I certainly am a proponent for it. I think that there are also a few other adaptogens that can be really powerful that are kind of in the mushroom family. If you're looking for more of like an energy boost, rhodiola tends to be quite nice, but some people, not everyone, but a few people can get kind of like adverse reactions to it. It can kind of make you feel hot and flushed and not all that great, but that's very few and far between. And so, yeah, I guess she said, I'm asking because I looked up what was in the Be Calm. And so the Be Calm, I'll just talk about it for a second, is a blend of albizia bark and flower, AKA the tree of happiness within traditional Chinese medicine. Historically, from my knowledge, the bark is more about like dealing with body and the flower more with mind, which makes a lot of sense. Avena sativa, which is wild oat straw, I had mentioned, sort of a Western herb. Ashwagandha, which we just spoke about, Schisandra berry, which is TCM, and can be used from beautifying, but it also is kind of nice and bitter and sweet. I'm not bitter, sour and sweet. Holy basil leaf, which is Brahmi, and in Ayurveda, I believe it's sort of known to help attain enlightenment, which is very cool. And then L-theanine, which is an active kind of component often found in green tea. And that's less of an herb and more of a compound, but it is good stuff. And then, of course, the CBD. So I think the energy that I get from that is very grounded and rooted, yet also expansive. And it really does get to the root. And I think so often in the Western world, we're talking about symptom and symptom and symptom, and we want to take a pill for this because that's the thing we feel. But when we can dive in below that actual symptom and understand where is it coming from, that's where the real work happens. And I think that this supplement is really good for supporting that.
Thank you so much for that description.
My pleasure.
So I think that, so I'm going to share just a last minute note in the chat function, but Gabe, where can we find you? How do we get access to your information, Plant People? How can we?
Sure. I will say it and I will type it in the chat. So co-founder of Plant People. Plant People is Plant People on Instagram. Across social media, if that's what you're interested, or plantpeople.co, as in company, as in Colorado, as in cohabitating, as in collaboration on the interweb. And then my personal information is Gabe Kennedy is my last name. That would, if you type that in, you would pop up on Instagram or the web or whatever social media platform of your choice is. And I'm more than happy to answer additional questions. We really like to show up as a resource and give voice to, an industry and be able to breathe clarity into an industry that has so much confusion and a lack of education and a lack of sort of uniform knowledge. So please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions that you may have around hemp, around cannabis, around CBD, around herbs, around food. We will do our best. I will do my best to answer them. And if I can't, I will let you know and we'll seek out the answer together. But yes, Gabe Kennedy, I'll just type it in right now and Plant People, and super, super grateful to have so many people join. It's phenomenal.
And thank you all for joining us this evening, this afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. And thank you again so much, Gabe. For those of you who are interested, Friday, actually tomorrow evening for this particular week, every other week it'll be Friday evenings, but tomorrow evening, we are going to have more of a conversational session for those of you who want to further digest this topic of this week, grief, ask questions, share reflections, and also connect with one another. So it's specifically for those who want to come and talk. So I hope to see you all there. 7 p.m. tomorrow. The information's on the website. And thank you all again so much. Have a lovely evening and wishing you all lots of safety and care. Thank you.
Thank you so much.